History records that before America was America in the 1700s, the spiritual awakening happened, known as the Great Awakening, between 1730 and 1755. And the Great Awakening was this time in what would become America where people really began to wrestle with and really engage with spirituality in kind of fanatical ways. And one of the key pieces of the Great Awakening was this sermon by Jonathan Edwards called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And in the sermon, Jonathan Edwards describes the realities of hell and the realities of sin and our brokenness in really vivid ways. And it stirred a lot of people toward a deeper religious conviction. And it really is something that is countercultural in today's world. Before the Great Awakening in the 1500s, Niccolo Machiavelli was writing basically instructions to a young man who was going to become a king. And this became known as the Prince. And in the Prince, Machiavelli is trying to give as much wisdom to this young man as he possibly can about how to rule. And he wrestles with this question: is it better to be feared as a king or loved as a king? And Machiavelli writes this. He says, it may be answered that one should wish to be both. But because it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved, when of the two either must be dispensed with. I think that's a challenging thought. I think in our modern world today, we always want God to be a loving God. We always want God to be this God in heaven who's really going to put up with anything that we want to do. And we want God to not have any kind of fear component. And yet Machiavelli says that for a king, if we have to choose, it's better to have the people fear you than it is to love you. We can get really frustrated about this. I think we can not like the idea of having to fear someone in authority. And yet I would say that all of the government systems in the world that function today function with some level of consequence for people who do wrong. All of the government systems today that function effectively in the world function with some level of consequence, that people are going to be in some way penalized because they do the wrong thing. Fear is an essential part of civilization. Living with the sense that consequence can happen is an essential part of living in the world and living around other people. And I think the reason that the fear of God has become so unpopular in the world today is because a lot of people have used it to manipulate people, have twisted it to say that if you don't do certain things, you're not going to get from God what you want to get from God. And they've used it to their advantage as opposed to pointing people to the person of Jesus Christ, as opposed to pointing people toward godly living. They've used it to kind of pen people into their own desires. In my own life, I've come to a really deep appreciation for the fear of God. I don't fear hell because I believe that God has sealed me in the power of the Holy Spirit through the person of Jesus Christ and my confession of giving my life to Jesus. I believe that is a sealing power in my life, so I don't fear hell. But I still fear God in incredible ways. I fear what God could do to my life if I had an affair. If tomorrow I decided I was going to have an affair and I began to progress in that direction, I fear the consequences of that decision. I fear what God could do in my life if I made unethical financial decisions. I fear what God can do in my life if I neglect my children and if I neglect raising them, or if I neglect caring and loving for my wife. I fear what God can do in my life if I neglect His Word, if I neglect meeting with Him. And that fear drives me back to Him. I want to challenge you guys this week to consider the fear of the Lord, specifically in the issue of sexuality and pornography. I want to challenge you to take some time, take 5 or 10 minutes this week, and write down what your life would look like 10 or 20 years from now if you continue in sexual addiction or if you begin a sexual addiction. What will your life look like in 10 or 20 years from now? How will that affect your kids if you're addicted to pornography? How will that affect your relationship with your wife if you're addicted to pornography? What would happen if that addiction escalated and you begin to act out with other people, you begin to have sexual affairs? What will your life look like if that would happen? That's the kind of stuff that, to be honest, it puts the fear of the Lord in me. And it says, Lord, that little temptation right now that I'm wrestling with, that I'm struggling with, is something that could become so much bigger if I let that into my life. Proverbs tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And men, I want you to be wise. I want you to be pursuing wisdom in your life. And I don't believe we can do that without fearing God in our life.